Great. Well, thank you so much, Tom, and welcome everybody. I'm so sorry I can't be there in person. It's a very strange time, as we all know. But the reality is, I've got to get into a rounders match in about an hour and a half because my youngest daughter is leaving her school this term, and I have to play on the parents' team, and that's been one of the small silver linings of the shocking 2 years we've had, which has been this discovery that because of technologies, we can rethink some of our assumptions about how the world works. And I think it will be one of those things that will continue, that we will be able to sit in meetings where someone will say, well, I'm going to hybrid in, I'm going to virtual into this meeting because I need to take my mum to the doctor, or my son has a play that he's in. And in a sense, that's the work that I have been thinking about over the last few years, which is what is the nature of the technology changes that we are going through, and how do they impact the ways in which we live our lives? How do they impact the ways our societies operate, the rules, the norms, the regulations, the institutions? Now, in a sense, I want to also say that I'm probably the first half of a couple of conversations on this, because I think after me on the panel, on the agenda, is the absolutely brilliant Joanna Bryson, who is one of the finest minds, I think, in talking about the question of the governance of artificial intelligence. So I would really strongly recommend that after I've spoken and Tom and I have done some questions, that you stick around to hear what Joanna has to say. Now, I have a book coming out in September. I've just hold up a sort of preview copy of it. It's called Exponential. And the subtitle of Exponential is How Accelerating Technology is Leaving Us Behind and What to Do About It. And I just want to unpack what some of that might mean, because we've obviously heard people talk about accelerating technology for a really, really long time. And the question is this time any different? And I think it is. I contend that it really is a different time this time round. And I do that by starting with a little story about where I live. So I live in northwest London, nestled between Cricklewood and Golders Green, very close to the Irish diaspora that sometimes clusters around this area. And where my house is today, 120 years ago, sat in a farm. In fact, it was one of the outer fields of a farm called Avenue Farm. And that was as late as 1895. And 200 metres to the northwest of my house was a blacksmith's, who would have been applying horseshoes to the horses that were London's prime mover in 1895. By 1925, 1930, my house had been built. The streets have the same layout they have today. There was electricity, the streets were paved, and there were cars, increasingly common. More than 20% of people in London in the UK had a car at that point, and horses had largely disappeared, certainly from the very centre of London. So in a very short period of time, in a 25 to 30 year period, London transformed from a Dickensian-style London to a London that's much more recognisable today. Electricity, electric light, cars, and so on. 200 metres northwest, by the way, from where I live, is no longer a blacksmith's in 2021. It's a co-op which furnishes me with milk and cheese and eggs on most Saturday mornings. And that shows a very rapid technological development that resulted as a consequence of three general purpose technologies that all appeared at about the same time. Those were the general purpose technology of the internal combustion engine that could be used in cars and motorbikes and planes and ships, and now in lawnmowers and helicopters and so on. The second technology was electricity, and the third technology was the telephone. They all emerged and started to become commercially viable in the 1890s, and by the first and second decades of the 20th century were proving that they were going to be very, very commonplace. The interesting thing, of course, is that there are those technological changes, but think about the societal changes that came with them. We went from Victorian era factories to factories modeled on mass production, where power was no longer restricted to a central drive shaft, but rather lived at the desks and at the workstations of more well-trained workers. We started to see the emergence of mass production as a business model, the strengthening of unions and a labour bargain. In other words, powerful general purpose technologies resulted in significant societal changes. Now, where do we find ourselves 100 years later? Well, 100 years later, we find ourselves in what I call the exponential age. And it's the exponential age is characterized by the presence not of 3 general purpose technologies, but 4 technology domains that have within them technologies that are improving very, very rapidly at what I call exponential rates. That is an improvement of more than 10% in a price performance basis every single year, compounding over many, many years and many decades. Those 4 domains, the one that we're most comfortable with is the domain of computing, in which we will put semiconductors and artificial intelligence. The second domain is the area of energy, renewable power, lithium ion storage. The third domain is that emerging domain of being able to tinker with our biology, from protein engineering to genome sequencing to genome editing to cell programming. And the fourth domain is the domain of manufacture, the arena of computer-controlled additive manufacturing, what you and I might call 3D printing. Now, what's interesting about each of those domains is that the core technologies that drive them are improving at these exponential rates. We're very familiar with the idea of Moore's law, which says that every couple of years, I'm just summarizing this, the power available for a fixed cost of a dollar or euro or a pound doubles. And that's why many of us today have supercomputers sitting unused in our kitchen desks, kitchen drawers. That is, after all, what an iPhone 7 or an old Samsung Galaxy is. If you go back to the early 1980s, when I first started using computers, not even NASA had computers as powerful as the ones that we regularly discard in our drawers, and that is the power of an exponential technology. But the thing is that is not restricted to just the computing domain. It's happening within computing storage. It's happened within bandwidth availability. It's also happening in domains like solar power. So, for example, the price of solar power has essentially declined by more than 20% every year compounded for more than 2 decades, to the point at which this year, one analyst came out and pointed out that solar power was now, and wind power as well, was cheaper than even running existing natural gas power stations. So from 5 years ago, when these renewables were too expensive, they're now the cheapest form of electricity. And we're seeing the same thing happen with lithium-ion battery storage declining at 18% price annually. And we're certainly seeing it in the biological domain, where the cost of sequencing a single human genome has declined from around $1 billion in 2000 to around $700 this year. And it's an incredible price decline. What happens when prices decline, of course, is that we consume more of these products, and that rise in consumption creates the opportunity for there to be many new complementary businesses that build on top of these technologies. Now, if you think about what happened between 1890s and 1915, 1920 with these 3 general technology platforms that redrew the landscape, the socio-economic landscape of advanced Western economies, those technologies existed in a much less interconnected economy, and they weren't exponential technologies. They didn't improve at 20, 50, 60% per annum. And so today we have these 4 sets of broad technologies. Some are as general as the previous era's general purpose technologies, some are less general, but they are improving very, very much more rapidly. That is getting much, much cheaper in a much more interconnected economy. And that sets the stage for a dramatic change in the way in which we live our lives and the way in which we govern ourselves. There is one of these technologies, in a sense, that stands up head and shoulders above the others, and that's because it's an integrative fabric technology, and that is a technology of computing and artificial intelligence. Because ultimately, what ends up being the control mechanism of synthetic biology or of additive manufacturing is the computer and the algorithms which control it. Now, pardon me, I've stopped there because an algorithm went wrong and threw up a warning in my screen. We have to get better at how our user interfaces work. So artificial intelligence has a rather different position in that it's both a general purpose technology, one of my four technology domains, but it's also the connective fabric that sits across the technologies that I talked about. So then the question that I posed, and I posed in the book, is if we do live in this exponential age of very, very rapidly changing technologies, what are the ramifications? There are some other obvious ramifications, one of which is visible through the empirical evidence, which is that we can bring products to market much faster and they can get much bigger, quicker than ever before. And anybody who blinked and missed the sudden arrival of TikTok will recognize that. There's a reason why we can get TikTok from being unheard of to being used by 1.5 billion people in a matter of months. And that is to do with the prevalence of these technologies in a distributed fabric around the globe. But of course, it's not just TikTok that grows very, very quickly. And one thing that we have seen as a consequence has been that innovators are able to build much, much larger companies much more quickly than ever before. And you can see that in the data. I think about a company like Hopin. I had a lot of fun writing the book because I wrote the book. These companies grew very, very fast, and I'd have to keep going back and changing their size. But if you take a company like Hopin, which was 2 or 3 people in November 2019, Hopin makes virtual tools for conferences. It's perfect for the sort of post-pandemic era. Within 18 months, Hopin had grown from 2 or 3 people to a $5.5 billion corporation. And that's an incredible rate of growth. And it's fundamental to the exponential age. So when I dig into the exponential age, I looked at further ramifications. Now, what does this really mean for the changes in the way that we govern things and run things? And I identified 5 main domains, and I'll just skim through them briefly. In the area of economics, one of the things that we have started to see is larger and larger companies like Google and Apple and Amazon. And we started to see that markets take the shape of what's called winner take most. So they don't look like competitive markets of yore, the kind of markets that I studied when I studied economics. They actually look like markets that tend to, if not outright monopoly, just a dominant market position. And one of the arguments I make is that this is a consequence of the platform business model that is enabled by the exponential age technologies. So that's one consequence, and there are some interesting ramifications that we have to contend with in society about how large we want these companies to be, how we want to manage them, how we want to moderate them, control them, or regulate them. But there are other ramifications. There's an important one around the question of employment and labour. A lot of times people talk about the risk of advanced technologies, particularly automation, being about the robo-apocalypse, the fact that robots will come in and take jobs. And there's scant evidence that that's actually what happens. The evidence does actually suggest that rather that what happens with automation in the economy is that it puts downward pressure on workers' ability to negotiate on their wages, on their relative power, except for those workers who are very, very highly skilled. So you get a sort of barbelling. The very skilled machine learning developers get paid basketball player style salaries, and the rest of the economy lives on a 0-hour contract. And there's another dynamic that happens with automation, which is that companies that automate heavily, like Amazon and Netflix, tend to perform really, really well. And they did really well during the pandemic. And so they ended up hiring lots and lots and lots of people. In fact, Amazon hired more than 500,000 people last year. Whereas companies that didn't automate, didn't invest in AI, ended up being uncompetitive and actually ended up going out of business and their workers losing their jobs. So it's a particularly nuanced picture as a kind of a consequence of the exponential age. The way I think about this in a sort of more coherent framework is this idea of the exponential gap, that on the one hand you have technologies that are accelerating away within their potential, and on the other hand you have our institutions which adapt in a linear way, and the gap between them, the exponential gap, is the source of a lot of the tension that we see towards big technology companies in the field of economics and competitive markets, the tension that we see in labour markets when we ask, what is it to have fair work for a worker and fair pay and fair conditions? It explains why we see so many strange geopolitical conniptions from cyber attacks and ransomware growing. And it also goes some way to explaining why we see tensions within our democratic processes and public space. The way that this plays out in local economies, though, I think is really, really very interesting, because we're coming out at the end of a 45 or 50-year period where globalization and global markets was the fundamental guiding mantra of policymakers around the world. One of the interesting things about exponential technologies is that they actually enable local markets and local production in a way that we haven't seen for a tremendous amount of time. 3D printing or additive manufacturing means that you don't need to ship finished goods from a factory in a different continent. You can, when those technologies are mature, which they will be soon, produce finished goods very, very locally on the metaphorical high street. Renewable power, whether it's solar and wind farms and municipal grid batteries and virtual power plants built by stringing together the batteries in electric vehicles, mean that you don't need to produce your electrical power at large capex intensive power stations that you put 300 miles away from population centres and then pipe over a national grid. You can actually create your power and your storage much, much more locally. High intensity vertical farms that can live in cities mean that you don't necessarily have to live at the end of a very, very long agricultural supply chain. And all of which creates new potentials for local economies and local communities and local decision making. So when I look at the exponential age, I think it's a really exciting and vibrant time for us to live through. It is replete with risks if we allow the exponential gap to go unattended. But if we do attend to that exponential gap, I do think it creates a platform from which we can continue to live sort of very fruitful lives. And Tom, I will ask you perhaps to come on stage, on the virtual stage, and we can have a discussion.
Azim, thank you very much. That was fascinating as always.
Hello?
Hi. Oh, sorry, just getting instructions in my ear, which I'm not used to. Azim, thank you very much. That was fascinating as always. Now, I think you did a really good job of foreshadowing the remaining sessions. I will have to apologise though, I fluffed your intro, but I think we'll put it down to my being slightly starstruck because I am a subscriber to your Exponential View newsletter. And if you don't mind, I think we'll pick your brains for a few more minutes. So we've got a couple of questions here. Now, whenever we think about artificial intelligence, I think we think immediately of the US and China as being AI superpowers. And the Tortoise AI Index, which I recommend everybody take a look at, would probably bear this out. And it has the UK at number 3, I guess, in the lead of a fairly strong pack. Do you think that the UK is investing enough in AI? And I'm thinking probably as much in terms of the exploitation, the application of AI, as it is in fundamental research.
Well, the question is anyone investing enough in this technology? And does can we point to any major economy that invests enough in research anywhere? And my suggestion would be that we can't. If we look at that index, it's really interesting because the US is far ahead of other countries, and China comes in second place, again far ahead of anyone else, and there's the UK. I mean, I think we have a tremendous opportunity here because we have extremely good universities with real depth of talent and capability. And I also think that we have a mature digital economy. I mean, it's the second most mature, perhaps the third most mature after the US and China in that sense, which means that we have executives who are used to living and working in companies that are very data driven, that use software as one of their key processes. And so that sets a stage for us to do quite well there. So we have the ingredients to be strongly competitive. Whether we are yet strongly competitive has to be seen. But better to be the UK than many of the other countries on that list.
Okay, and I guess a question that brings things a little bit more local or regional to Northern Ireland. So you may have seen that Northern Ireland released its 10x economy strategy, and I think that actually aligns well with your thinking around the exponential age. And I was intrigued by this morning's newsletter where you introduced the hourglass or the barbell, a concept where there seems to be opportunities for the bargain basement, but quality, items, entities, regions, and then the high-end curated experience, but nothing in the middle. So where do you think that leaves a small region like Northern Ireland? I mean, can it be all things to all men, or does it need to focus with sort of a very laser approach?
I mean, it's a big and difficult question. On the one hand, as we move into these more advanced post-industrial economies, products get much more complex. As we heard we think about building the mRNA vaccines, and complex products need to bring together lots and lots of specialists. And typically that bringing together, that process of agglomeration happens in cities. And it's why you need cities to build sophisticated products, because you need to have lots and lots of subspecialities. And so I think cities have a strong part to play in exponential economies. But on the other hand, there's another opportunity, which is a relocalization that I touched on at the end of my talk, which is that these new technologies also enable many more local economies. So that may mean that for products that are part of people's everyday, rather than the really, really sophisticated, demanding products, those things can be much more local and much less reliant on very, very long supply chains or people playing a small role in each of those. I think broadly that means it's good news for local economies. I think it's also good news for local economies because the overarching dogma of globalization and the value of being a tiny little productive cog that does one part of a global supply chain has started to shift. And it started to shift at the time that the technologies have really allowed us to do other things. So can you build a 10x economy in a smaller region like Northern Ireland? The answer is you probably can do that if you recognise that there are forces that work in your favour, and think about how to tackle the countervailing forces, which are the forces of agglomeration and talent.
Thanks, Azim. I guess one final question. So, you've said in the past that you think technology is too important to be left to technologists. I think that probably feeds into our next conversation with Professor Bryson, but could you expand on that briefly?
Yeah, of course. The traditional technology industry has had 40 years or 50 years or so where it's really not, it's presented itself in a way that says it doesn't need to be inspected by anyone not in the industry. In other industries, whether it's financial services or aviation or pharmaceuticals, we allow outside inspectors in the whole time to come in and say, what are you actually building? Is it safe? Is it not safe? Is it good? Or where does it work? Where doesn't it work? That hasn't been the case in the traditional technology industry. And technologists have, in a sense, self-managed by saying, we have the answer, and that answer is this amazing rate of technical progress that we can demonstrate to you. And what we're starting to learn is that now that technology isn't so much about questions relating to the boot time of your new laptop, but rather questions that relate to what is the quality of work that an algorithmically managed worker gets, or do our democratic and media processes work at all? Those are really, really important questions, and they're not questions that can solely be answered from the realm of the engineering discipline wrapped inside a profit-seeking corporation.
Thank you very much, Azim. I appreciate your time. Hopefully we'll continue the conversation at some point. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Okay.